Welcome to Canada's Social Changemakers. My name is Justin Douglas, and today I'll be in conversation with Mumilaaq Qaqqaq, NDP member for Nunavut. Mumilaaq has been an activist for a long time, and now she's here to discuss all of the work that she's doing in the North and with the Canadian government. So thank you so much, Mumilaaq, for being here.
Thank you for having me, Justin. I really appreciate it.
Just a quick acknowledgement, I am coming to you today from Southern Vancouver Island, which is the traditional territory of the Algonquin-speaking peoples, also known as the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations, as well as the Wasanich peoples. Great, so to get into the conversation, first of all, just give us a little background on yourself, where you grew up in Iqaluit, in Bear Lake, I think, and sort of what your childhood was like, and how you entered into the realm of community activism.
Absolutely. So my name is Mumilaaq Qaqqaq. I'm the Member of Parliament for Nunavut, the biggest electoral riding in the world, with one of the smallest populations for a riding. Collectively, the territory is not much bigger than Summerside, PEI, or Brandon, Ontario, if you can kind of gather the vast amount of land compared to the small population that is up there. I believe that my entire life, especially as an Inuit and as an Indigenous person, that my whole life is political, from the moment I'm born to the moment I'm passed, and even far beyond that to an extent. We've seen instances where even after death, Indigenous groups that have very special ceremonies that need to happen at a certain time in a certain way, we've seen that been denied. So even after death, sometimes for Indigenous peoples, we see that inequality and those injustices. So I believe that my whole life and every aspect of it is political because of the colonization, neglect, and oppression that we have seen from the federal government, particularly towards Inuit. And just as a side note as well, Inuit means people. There's no need to say Inuit people because you're just saying people. So
That's good, thank you.
it's just Inuit. And you know, I was on Instagram Live the other day, and I just remembered the phrase I used to use in high school was, how many people have to die and how loud do we have to cry before somebody listens to us? And that saying still rings true. So I think that after decades of liberal and conservative failures for Inuit, for First Nations, for Métis Nations, that it's time that we talk about realities in a way that we should. And we're starting to see a global discussion. You can argue whether or not it's positive or negative sometimes, of course, but I think that we need to have these difficult discussions in order to be able to move forward, in order to actually progress and see those gaps in inequality shortened. And that's what I'm here to do. And if we want to actually have Canada diverse and inclusive, we need to have all levels of all different kinds of institutions reflect that. And it starts with individuals that look like me filling those institutions that typically are meant for and run by older white men.
1000% agree with you. Thank you. That's a great opening statement. I think that you sort of entered into politics through the Daughters of the Vote experience. I think it was 2017. You gave a speech in the House of Commons. I watched your speech. It absolutely blew me away. I was so moved by it. Can you talk about that experience and then how it led you into running with the NDP?
Yeah, so Daughters of the Vote, I would say, would just be the point in time where I got national recognition for the things that I was saying. I wouldn't say at all that it was the kickstart of me being politically active, I guess, if you will. And the amount of potential opportunity that you get in the North as a youth, you know, with all the challenges and issues that happen in the North, there's lots of opportunities for youth. And I got to travel through Northern Youth Abroad, and I've been to Africa. I've been to every province and territory except for Saskatchewan and Newfoundland, and I'd really love to get to both of them. But I think that people kind of have this idea that Northerners don't know much about the South, and really it's Southerners are sometimes completely clueless about the North. But as Northerners and as Inuit, we have learned that life is not gonna necessarily adapt to us. We have to adapt to it, especially when we have to access such oppressive and discriminatory systems all the time. It's almost always about survival mode, always making sure that you're safe and you have food, shelter, and water. And Inuit are very resilient. Unfortunately, we don't have to be, and I think that's the whole conversation that we're having between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples is not going in the direction that it should be. We've jumped truth and gone to into reconciliation without even understanding really what situation we're in already. What broken, racist, discriminatory policies and procedures have led us to this point? So I was starting to put two and two together long before 2017, and just really realizing really quickly after graduating in 2011 that there's a reason why we are in the situation that we are in. This isn't normal. It's not normal to see suicide at the rates we do, or violence or abuse, death, murder, death by RCMP. It's not normal to see what I saw growing up. And it breaks my heart to say this because I shouldn't have to say it like this, but I was very fortunate. I grew up with food, water, and shelter. And I shouldn't have to say that I'm fortunate. That should be normal across the country. So being being a teenager and not fully understanding how we got into the state that we are in, because in the school curriculums, and Nunavut follows the Alberta curriculum, education curriculum, they don't teach us about Canadian history. They don't teach us about residential school or the 60 scoops or the dog slaughters. They don't teach us about those things to the extent that they should. So once I realized I didn't like social studies because I couldn't relate to it, what do I have to relate to World War One and Two? But that's what I was learning. That's what I was memorizing. And I couldn't tell you anything about it at this point in time, because when I learned it I couldn't relate to it. I didn't find it useful. Why did I need to learn these things that I'm not planning on going to war, and I don't think that we're going to see war to an extent like that in the future. So it was just really odd. And very quickly after I graduated, I realized that I didn't like school because I didn't learn my history, because I couldn't connect to it. I couldn't connect to what I was learning. It seemed completely irrelevant to me at times. So I did a lot of coaching, a lot of fundraising, a lot of sports. With all those challenges and issues going on in the North, sport is a really easy way to stay distracted. And quite frankly, kind of it was my excuse to try and get away from homework.
Mm.
Um, Not that it worked often, but I tried. So I like to think my political activism started when I was a teenager, because that's when I started promoting health and well-being, taking care of yourself, having healthy coping mechanisms, having those healthy outlets. It's fine to be angry at the world, but I'd rather you take it out in hockey or soccer than take it out in the classroom towards a teacher. So just being able to try and find my place, or trying to find spots to be able to do my part, to just try and create that positive, whatever positive contribution I could make, because I believe if we're fortunate to be able to not be worried about eating, drinking, or having a place to live, then we should be helping other people that do. And yeah, I think my activism started once I realized it was important to help people. And my mom and my dad, my parents taught me that very early. So I think I don't think my parents thought they were going to raise politicians, my brothers on the Hamlet Council, but they definitely did.
That's amazing. I think that's an understatement, because you are a fierce advocate in a way that I find truly inspiring. And that was one of the reasons it was really important for me to speak with you today. But just going back to the election for one quick minute, when you were running, I think you were 25 years old at the time. It was an election between three Inuk women, the health minister of the Conservative Party at the time, and a Liberal candidate who was able to raise a lot more money than your campaign, and somehow still you became the elected member. So can you talk about that experience, a little bit of running and being elected?
I think what came fresh in this experience anyways was that it was a breath of fresh air. It was a breath of reality. It was a breath of hope. And I think on the political level, just barely a year ago, I started campaigning. I actually, I think I'm one of very few MPs that have a Snapchat, like a work Snapchat account.
Probably.
And I had a memory come up today from a year ago saying, this is Mumilaaq Qaqqaq, your NDP candidate. I live in Iqaluit, da 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 da. Anyways, it was an intro. And I was like, wow, 1 year ago. And it was crazy. It was one of the, besides my life now, it was one of the craziest 6 weeks ever. And in the north, and I'll speak specifically to Nunavut in this instance, but in Nunavut, myself personally, I could tell you how the prime minister got their position. And that was about it in high school. And I understood that the federal government controlled every aspect of my life, but I didn't understand how policy and procedure aspects of regulations and law directly impacted from that national federal level down to the individual with a family in a smaller community. So politics in general in Nunavut is not something that's unknown, but it's definitely something that needs a big boost in creation of awareness of how especially party system works. So at the time, it was a lot of just showing up. Sometimes that's and realistically, as a member of parliament, that's what your job is to do. Your job is to show up, and your job is to advocate for your constituents. Your job is to be able to have respectful conversations. Your job is to be able to try and find solutions to issues after you present them. I think that I do a very good job in my job. This is supposed to be my job. And sometimes I get comments from other members of parliament that I do such a good job going to the age thing. And I'm like, isn't this our job? Aren't we supposed to be having conversations and advocating for our constituents? So I just find adults are interesting, and really, do we practice what we preach? We look at children and we say we want them to be kind and loving and supportive. But do we actually reflect? Do we actually intentionally do that as adults? Not just with our friends and with people we know, but in our work, in our day-to-day life, in our interactions with strangers. We should always be striving to do more and to do better. And I'm just gonna say it bluntly, I was definitely not in it for the money. I definitely was making very okay money beforehand. And it was at that point in time the best way for me to help the most amount of people that I thought I could. And I grab every opportunity I can to try and help create better policy and procedure to actually reflect the needs of Inuit. And with that understanding of the history, with understanding of oppressive policy and procedure, with a 26-year-old head on my shoulders that, quite frankly, 50-year-old white men don't want them telling what's working and what's not, and why it is or why it isn't. And I think that's what Nunavut needed and wanted, and needs and wants. And it's one thing to stand there and say suicide is 9 times the rate in Nunavut, but it's another to say that through colonial and oppressive government policy and procedure, law, regulation, history, through dog slaughters, forced relocation, residential school, through all of this, the least that the federal government can do after decades of neglect is provide those basic human rights. And it's really hard for people sometimes that aren't aware of that history to and the federal government continues to fuel racist ideations and racist conversations, quite frankly, by not being involved in conversations where they are asked to be. And when we talk about reconciliation, when we talk about, again, going back to that truth and reconciliation, we skip the truth. Because the truth is, we have not seen justice for the thousands of children that were raped, that were hit, that were verbally abused, and that didn't come home, and all the survivors that have lived with that trauma since. It's absolutely horrific that tens of thousands of kids, babies, imagine your little 5-year-old being taken away for school to beat the Indian out of him. And there's lots of people still alive. You know, there's people my dad's age, my grandparents' age. Like, people think this is ended 150 years ago. This ended when the year my younger brother was born. And I
It
think
breaks my heart.
it's so crazy though that that it the advantage that the federal government has by not doing anything, by not creating that awareness, by not putting it into our education system, by not being a part of conversations, they directly fuel racist ideations and conversations, and don't think they have a responsibility to be a part of them. And I'm there to make sure they do right.
That's really a lot of things that I want to dive deeper into there. I think just to start off, I think Nunavut has a history of consensus-based politics, and correct me if I'm wrong, but in traditional circles, it was a different style of governance than what the British parliamentary system has brought in. And I think I've heard you speak publicly a little bit about having to move into a system which is not inherent to your culture, and having to then go into that system to say, hey, I deserve these rights, we deserve these rights, why do I have to enter your system and play your game in order for us to have these basic human rights? And can you sort of talk about the conflict of the traditional system and the traditional ways of doing things versus having to move into another system to have that same recognition?
Right. So, and you're right, I talk about having to navigate and work in systems that don't make sense and don't make sense for us and that we are forced into. What puts on another level of complexity is this discussion around Indigenous governance or independence or self-determination, whatever word that you want to use, that basically says that we can decide our future and what that looks like. Because we have this notion that there was a traditional way and somehow we get to be able to go back to that. So I think the conversation has turned into, first off, an Indigenous and non-Indigenous one, and there is no space or room for the middle. It seems to be one or the other a lot of the time. That's what we're seeing in the Mi'kmaq territory. That's what we're seeing on Wet'suwet'en, that it's You're for or against, and you're Indigenous or not, and that's it. We're not creating a room of discussion. And I've been thinking about this a lot lately. As Indigenous peoples, as Indigenous groups, pre-contact with the federal government, pre-colonization, we understood that we were a part of the world, the earth, and the earth was a part of us. We are a part of the cycles. We were not above it. We are part of it. We needed it to survive. As UK system style of government, as what do we call them now? Westernized society ideation, or whatever the wording is.
Sure, all that.
When all that came over on the ship because they were lost looking for India, that we don't talk about how that policy and procedure has changed and influenced over time. So when we're looking at Inuit and Nunavut, I'm talking about going from a nomadic lifestyle to the one we are currently in the past 40 years, 50 years. So my father, for example, and keeping in mind I am 26, so my dad's not that much older, he was born on the land, and his father was born on the land. And so he wasn't born in a health center, he wasn't born in a hospital. At a very early age, they moved into Territory, into a community, because his dad knew that change was coming, and he knew the best thing that he could do for his family was go to where there was going to be work and where the change in life was going to happen. So in some ways, my family's story is not as horrific as some of many other ones that you hear often across the territory, but people forget that this is 50, 60 years ago. This is not multiple generations ago. So when we're looking at that history and those impacts, what we're looking at is a series of unfortunate events. And what happened at the time of the Nunavut Agreement, as outstanding as those Inuit negotiators did, what people don't realize was even at the time of those negotiations, Inuit were learning a different language. Inuit were learning about a written language. All of our history is oral. We don't have books. We don't have documented written history. And that at the time, and here's, like, I think that people need to think about how we perceive all things in life. What is consequence? What is respect? What is an agreement? An agreement for Inuit used to mean a verbal, I say, Justin, you have this piece of land, I have this piece of land. Yes, we shake hands maybe, but we have this understanding now. We have a verbal agreement, and that's what a lot of Indigenous groups across Canada had and respected that. And now all of a sudden you're in a system of governance where it needs to be written. So you could be in a conversation where it's like, this is what we want, and all of a sudden it doesn't get written down, but the other person can say, no, this is what you have. And can you read English? Like, it's really nutty to think about the crunch time and it's outstanding what the negotiators did. It's remarkable to have an external force come in, start killing your dogs, start taking away your people for TB treatment, start forcing individuals into communities, not give them adequate housing, food, or water. Somehow, before internet and before major telephone communication, across the biggest electoral riding in the world, and get to Ottawa and do those negotiations and have a territory come out of it. It's mind-blowing.
Yeah, it's mind-blowing.
It is so crazy. It's
yeah,
phenomenal
it also blows my
to think
mind,
about what they did.
Yeah, to jump on that, it also blows my mind that through the Indian Act and through other legislative mechanisms, the federal government has been able to say, well, in order for you to prove that this is a right, there has to be a historical connection. And that somehow First Nations, Métis, Inuit people are not able to change and progress and grow with the times and reclaim their culture. It seems that if it was something that was frozen in time 50 to 100 years ago, then there's a treaty right to fisheries, or land usage. But if you can't prove that was the case 50 years ago, then there's no longer a right to it. And some white guy in an office in Ottawa gets to decide for you which rights.
Exactly.
And that is something that has blown my mind and has frustrated me beyond words can express. And this is not my lived experience. So I can't even imagine what it would be like for someone who has had to live that experience. And so that sort of transitions me into my next question about how to reclaim, rebuild your culture, looking towards traditional mechanisms, but also being a member of a modern world and a modern society, and how you balance your identity through the modern and through historical truths. I know these are not easy questions.
Yeah, there's just a lot to unpack, and I'm trying to figure out where to start. And I'm going to start with the toughest subject and just get it out of the way. I think, and again, I'm going to talk specifically to what I've seen in the territory and interaction with other Inuit. There's, and this is the other thing that infuriates me, that the federal government does not provide those basic human rights, but they do not deal with the repercussions of what comes out of that. We see violence and abuse typically where we see struggle, where we see poverty, where we see, of course, if you are struggling to eat, drink clean water, and have a safe place to sleep, I'm sure people get aggressive, get irritated, get frustrated, agitated. Of course, people are gonna lean more towards violence, towards negativity, towards unhealthy coping mechanisms, towards unhealthy outlets. And I think that it's heartbreaking that we often don't ask why a person is the way they are. We just kind of look at them and say, ugh, it's like the stereotypes. And substance abuse is huge in the territory. But when you look at that history of oppressive policy and procedure, when your life went from providing for your family to not being able to hunt and not being able to do that, to seeing, oh my goodness, now I'm getting off track a little bit, but in 1983, the white coat ban, the sealskin white coat ban came into play. The sealskin market came crashing down, and a lot of hunters lost their means of income to be able to buy their hunting equipment, to be able to go and actually hunt. And I remember I worked in suicide prevention with the government of Nunavut for about 1.5 years. And now I completely forget the question, but I'm going to finish this part and come back.
Go for it.
But my father, and I was trying to remember earlier how old my dad is. I don't want to say his exact age, but he's in his early 60s. And he said, I remember in 1984, and I got goosebumps all over my body because I know 1983 that the white coat sealskin ban came into play, and that's where we saw a spike in suicide. And I'm pretty sure it's because of that sealskin market crash was kind of the last blow to the role of man in family, in community. The role of man was to provide. All of a sudden, you have your dogs killed, your means of transportation to go and hunt is taken away. You are supposed to stay in a community and supposed to access federal government funds. Is a lot more than what you can get for furs. Just all of these things happen around the same time that impact your role in society, your role in being an individual, in being in a family, in being in a community. It has been hit multiple times from so many different angles. And I had said before, I'm pretty sure the white coat ban was the last punch in the face, basically, for the role of man, and that's where we saw suicide spike, and we've never seen it really come down since. And sure enough, my dad was like, I remember, and he named all the people that year in 1984. And sure enough, I could go back and I can find records and whatnot. But it was just that realization of my dad's generation was the one that went through all those impacts. And of course, it's happened at different points in time for different areas and different regions. But what people don't realize is when a child is not doesn't learn how to love, they can't teach to love. So when we're talking about residential schools and intergenerational trauma, and we see this in a lot of Indigenous peoples, where whether it's themselves, their parent, or maybe their grandparent, if a child was taken away for school, say at the age of 7, you'll see a cycle it's really hard to break, and it's also really easy to create sometimes when it's that deep and intense and that traumatizing, where if a child was taken away at the age of 7 to residential school, oftentimes depending on their experience, and especially if it was really horrible, how if they didn't learn love at the age of 7, how can they teach love to a 7-year-old? And so if they're not teaching their 7-year-old love, it doesn't even matter for how long, how that child takes it then creates another cycle. And that's where we see intergenerational trauma start. And I'm not even even just not experiencing a hug all year at school. Do you think the parent is now going to start hugging their child? If you don't learn these kinds of things, and these seem like very simple skills, they seem like very straightforward relationship skills, community interaction, human socializing, when there isn't that positive, loving, caring support, oftentimes it creates these cycles of lack of love, care, and support.
Of
And
course.
oftentimes, and that's what kids need. Kids want responsibility, kids want to be encouraged, but and there's so much to unpack in all of this, and in the history in itself, in intergenerational trauma. I've been trying to figure out, when we look at individuals that have been to war that have PTSD, I've had conversations with many Inuit who have found the body of a loved one who had just died by suicide, who has seen significant amounts of abuse. In 2000, the 2006-8, I believe it was over a 2-year span, Inuit health survey of the it was Inuit, just for Inuit, and of the men and women they talked to, 1 in 2, 52%, half the women said they experienced severe child sexual abuse. And when you just think about that, and think about how that was almost 15 years, about between 10 and 15 years ago. Numbers haven't gotten better anywhere else, so it's safe to suspect that those numbers haven't gotten better anywhere either. But if it's 52, if it's 1 in 2 women, well, who's doing this? And me in my position, I know other things like Nunavut is the only territory or province that does not release the names of individuals that have child sexual abuse related offenses.
Hmm.
It is, and apparently there's 600 names on that list of individuals walking around in Nunavut. Well, why is that? Why is it so easy to get away with so much in the territory? Suicide is 9 times the rate. What about the instances where people say, well, that person would never do that?
Hmm.
What about the instances where somebody dies by RCMP? There was a guy in, I believe, Gingnite at the beginning of this year who has died by RCMP. Is anyone asking those questions or looking into it? No. There's Baffin Mining Company where there's groups of Inuit that aren't for a mine, and that happens across the territory, and we can look at these things and we can relate them to the Mi'kmaq territory. We can relate them to Wet'suwet'en. We can relate them to Chantel Moore being killed on her wellness check. We have so many instances that happen in the territory like this. It's just they're happening on such a small scale. And sorry, I shouldn't say a small scale. They're happening on a huge scale for our population. But the way all the systems are able to be so oppressive and work so well against us, it works in the federal government's favor. They don't have to take care of a couple 10,000 Inuit, and it's really expensive. Where are our subsidies? Where are those negotiation obligations being fulfilled? And that's the other thing, going back to talking about policy and procedure, talking about legislation, having in there, you must have accomplished this by this time and update us at these points in times. Even having a deadline is not something that leaders might have been thinking about at the time. So when you look at four things with teeth, the federal government knew what it was doing and made sure it was written with a ton of loopholes, a ton of gaps, and all the room and opportunity in the world. They were never interested in actually taking care of the North. They want the resources and the land that comes with it. And that's what they've been able to do. The circumstances have been able to just play out wonderfully for them to keep this smaller group oppressed. And we talk about the right to self-determination. Well, how can you determine yourself what you decide to do with your life if you are living in a 2-bedroom home with 10 other people? Your uncle sexually abuses you, your mom has a substance abuse problem because of all the things that have happened so recently, whether it's residential school, church, boarding home, they call them hostels sometimes. And I'm not even capturing all of the major things that happen. I haven't talked about identification discs that Inuit were made to wear because the federal government officials and the RCMP were too lazy to learn how to say our names. Here's a number, it's easier.
Yeah, that's so disappointing. And it's such a part of Canadian history that I agree has been completely erased from our education. I mean, it's so often the education is written by the victors, or the history is written by the victors. And I can only speak to my experience in British Columbia, but we have the highway of tears of missing and murdered Indigenous women. We've had William Pickton, who was a serial killer that targeted low-income women, including Indigenous women. And so for me, I feel like there has been a clear history of the federal government with intent to erase Indigenous peoples. And what you were talking about, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and ways of trying to now reconcile these things in our history without taking the time to acknowledge that these things have taken place and now saying, okay, we acknowledge it, but we're sorry, let's move on, rather than being like, hey, let's really talk about trauma healing. Let's talk about how we can move people forward. And these are such giant issues, and there's no way that either one of us have all the answers, but how do you feel the process of healing begins for the people of the North?
I think it's truth, and I think it's being able to treat us with dignity and respect. I talk a lot, and the things are so complicated, and I know there's no one be-all end-all solution. And I know that money is a factor and a number of other things, but I don't think human life should be valued. It's invaluable. We shouldn't be saying, Nunavut, you're worth X amount of dollars in your housing. And we shouldn't be willing to just let the federal government delay a national response in calls to action for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and just let it be okay. Because that's what's beginning to happen at the federal level. We're just letting it be okay. Of all the things I've talked about and how crazy amazing it is to have something like the Nunavut Agreement, although not perfect, what we are asking people to do is go through immense amounts of trauma and PTSD to see entire communities go through epidemics of suicide, of death, and to have to watch people like me, to have to watch people like Romeo Saganash, a residential school survivor, to go through all the things that we do and see in our communities in life, and to have to stand there and try and I feel like I am justifying to the federal government why people that look like me, why people that come from the same culture, why we deserve to live, to be alive after just having and continuing to have, because of the immense amounts of trauma that cycles of trauma that continue to play out in the territory. Now you want me to stand in the House of Commons and say this isn't right, we are losing too many people. The amount of families and friends that I've lost, the amount that everybody in the territory has lost. There are multiple people everywhere that have had multiple siblings die by suicide, multiple children die by suicide. Could you imagine being in such a desperate state that you don't know, you think your only option in life is to end it and that's the best one? I don't understand how I can stand there and repeatedly say over and over, people are choosing to die. This isn't normal. Nothing about this is normal. No one chooses to die. Why are we putting people in such a dire state that that's the outlet that they're coming to? When we look at things like mental health, when we look at things like how we access it, how we provide it, how we talk about it, oftentimes what we don't also do is link that trauma, that PTSD to physical. Our brain is just as important as our heart, our lungs, your brain is what runs everything, is what tells you what to do. And I bet if you looked at people that have been to war, and Inuit have been through some really, really intense things. I have heard Inuit have said to me, it's not normal to see somebody without a head. And it's not. So why am I, a 26-year-old Inuit woman, standing at the House of Commons talking about all this horrific stuff that happens almost daily in the territory, where we're losing people unnecessarily to systems? And here's the other, they give you 35 seconds to answer a question. How can we haven't even unpacked a whole bunch of other things to unpack, and we're having a conversation that needs to be had? But how can you expect me to explain to you what you're doing wrong and what everybody else before you has done wrong? Who, what, when, where, why, how? And again, looking back at it, I'm one representative out of 338. Systems not built for me. Systems not built for who I represent. And you turn around and clap and say, look, you're here. We're yay diversity, yay inclusion. But we're not actually going to listen to anything she says. We're not actually going to take it into consideration. We're not going to ask her to sit down and meet with us. We're not going to ask her, how do we actually achieve reconciliation as non-Indigenous peoples? A whole department for a whole group of people. Shouldn't that tell you that we are failing somewhere? Like it just absolutely
Yeah, it blows my mind. I mean, when we talk about issues of the North, I think you've covered a lot of them already: the colonial legacy, the moving nomadic peoples into inadequate housing with overpopulation in small housing, not access to, lack of access to food, to water, to proper resources, to income disparities, the lack of respect for women within the culture, violence against women, against children, sexual violence. There is this whole plethora of these really deep and troubling issues: intergenerational trauma, being taken away from residential schools. And through all of this, the peoples of the North have shown such a resilience and such a beautiful way of trying to maintain their culture through so much adversity. And so I can't even imagine what that plight is like and having to go through it. But could you maybe just talk a little bit more about some of the challenges and how we can at least start addressing some of the solutions? Like, what could the federal government actually do to change and address the needs of the communities?
I think that, and I try steer quite a ways away from my personal, especially talking too much about my parents, because they've moved mountains for me, and I think that they've done what they can. And shout out to my mom's amazing, and has put up with me for 26 years, and I'm sorry, but she stuck with me forever. And
That's amazing.
but I was very fortunate, and I have a hard time saying that too, because we as human beings, we don't choose what situation we're born into, and we don't choose what experience, environment, and we don't choose how we're going to walk through the world. We're just given what we got, and that's it. But I was very fortunate in how I was raised, and my mom, who's white, I'm half Danish and half Inuk, but I'm not Greenlandic for the record.
Good to know.
Some people are like, "Wow, so you're Greenlandic." That's not how it works, but good try, good try. Um, so, and my mom knew growing up that I needed to have uh, a bit more of an understanding of how the world worked down south, and how I could access things like education and job opportunities, but also really develop my skill set, and very much pushed me to do whatever I was interested in growing up. And I was very fortunate in that way. But I had friends who died by suicide, whose parents would beat them regularly, who didn't have food on the table regularly, who were couch surfing regularly. And so, although I didn't see these things in my home directly, and I don't think that you should have to advocate it for it by any means. But I have seen and dealt with a lot directly. Whether that's talking best friends out of attempting to kill themselves, to there's family situations continuously going on. So there's lots of trauma in communities, and there's lots of things that have happened in such a short amount of time, and things just keep building and building up. Oftentimes in a family, you'll hear of multiple deaths, whether that's suicide or murder or both. You'll hear of a lot of poverty, of a lot of kids that are hungry, and you'll hear of a lot of trauma, basically. So where do we start at? Where do we start looking at how we unpack that, how we talk about it, how we build back up? Is that one of the quotes that liberals are using? Did I just say a liberal quote? I think I did. Ew, I said it. No. I'm right by the sink. I could wash my mouth out with soap if I really wanted. But how can, okay, first, how can we expect an individual comes into the world, here you go, thrive and strive as we all should, and then not provide basic human rights. So what we need to do first and foremost is we need to get people fed and hydrated and regular sleep. You can't expect a child to learn as much on a hungry stomach or be able to learn as much if they can't sleep. And all the stuff I've been talking about, my best friend growing up, I remember I got livid at him one time because he didn't show up one morning and we had a test. Little did I know, one of the parents was up all night drinking, and this was a regular occurrence. And that day, I just decided to blow up. But what we don't realize too is what people are going through already. Mental health resources are so scarce in the north. What ends up happening is people are telling their trauma over and over and over and over and over again because there isn't enough funding from the federal government for those resources. So first, at the federal level, provide those 3 basic human rights, provide the water infrastructure to end all boil water advisories in all 25 Nunavut communities. 2, provide that adequate housing, provide safe spaces. 73% of Inuit Nunganga does not have safe spaces for women and children. Women in the north experience violence at 3 times the rate. Most communities don't have a safe place for them to go to. So what happens when it's minus 60 in January and you're in a community like Baker Lake and you have 4 kids and your husband is on a drunk rampage that night? Where do you go? What do you do? To another overcrowded home? Do you have safe family to go to? So, basic human rights: food, shelter, water. Oh, food, I almost missed. Provide subsidies for the airlines. Northern Airlines are our essential service. It's our ambulance, it's our highway, it's our food source, it's our medicine, it's everything. It's an essential service. You cannot have people living in the north without airlines, so subsidize them. That way we can see food prices drop. That way we can see construction prices drop, increase in housing, decrease in prices for food. Include country food in there. What Canada deems as healthy food is different, can be different in the north. Healthy food for me is whale meat, caribou meat, is wildlife. Include that. Program Nutrition North is what is used in the north. It's a horrible program. You can sell country food, but the list of regulations they have there is ridiculous. There's no way that you could achieve that right now in the territory. You're saying, here's the solution, but I'm not going to give you the means to be able to do it. I'm going to put a bunch of barriers up in there too. Really what those things I think boil down to is money. We might cost too much to be given basic human rights.
Yeah, and that's a ridiculous argument because if you look at the Panama Papers, tax evasion, the banks charging fees and then giving them to soccer kids, I mean, there is money, there are resources. It's just a matter of where, as a society, we choose to allocate those resources. And so often, oil, profits, this capitalistic billionaire Jeff Bezos, who has too much money that he could ever use, while the majority of other people live in destitute poverty, is insane. And so the system is no longer working. And just to not move off too quickly from all these important topics, but I also feel like climate change is an important topic of our times right now. And in British Columbia, in southern Vancouver Island, we just had the forest fires through the United States. The air quality in Victoria was the worst on the planet for a couple of weeks. And I think the people here are really waking up to the fact that it doesn't matter how much money you have, if you can't breathe oxygen, you're not going to survive. And so could you talk maybe a little bit about some of the changes you've seen in the north and how that's affecting people?
Absolutely. I think that we can no longer call them forest fires. I think we need to call them climate fires, because what is happening is not just affecting our forests anymore, but it's affecting everything. And I think that forest fires, to a degree, were an occurrence that had happened at a point in time. But humans, people, we have pushed the earth into such a depressing state that we are seeing directly. Mother Earth is telling us we are not doing a good job. She is telling us loud and clear, and we are seeing it all across the globe. The climate crisis is interesting to talk about in regards to the north, because we are not the big polluters, but we experience the direct outcomes of those big polluters heavily, and often most noticeably and first. So growing up, the irony for me, Baker Lake is the only inland community of the 25 in the territory, therefore no seals, therefore no polar bears. So people always think I come from a land of sea and polar bears, seals and polar bears, but I don't. In saying that, though, I come from a place where there's lots of land animals and there's tons of wildlife in the north. Yes, narwhals are real. People think they're a made up thing. People think that. If you just ask the internet, people think they are like a majestic, magical
Unicorns.
unicorn, water
Mm-hmm.
unicorn. It's
Mm-hmm.
crazy. Um, and that's what our ancestors have relied on for hundreds, if not thousands, if not longer, years. We understand, again, going to that, we are a part of the environment. We should cater to it, not it to us. And that's one thing that I think that mm, I I say I've gone through my midlife crisis at a very early age, and people kind of laugh at me. But what I mean is that I've just kind of put two and two together in a lot of ways that sometimes a lot of people don't stop and think about. Um, when one part of an ecosystem or one change has the power to ripple affect our communities, but not just our communities, soon, if we keep going down this road, eventually, forget natural resource extraction debates. We're going to be fighting over air and water. Our kids are going to be talking about the realistic aspects of those conversations. People look at me kind of like you're crazy. No, they 100%. If we keep going down this road, we will be fighting over air and water. We will be fighting over clean water. Where do we see that most in Canada? In the north. We're already seeing mining exploitation. We're already seeing natural resource extraction pilot things, so much for cleaner, greener initiatives. That's where we should be moving towards. Of course, there are solutions for the situations that we're in. The irony of Nunavut is that all communities run off diesel.
Mm.
Well, what kinds of initiatives is the federal government doing to get us off that? Why aren't you looking at cleaner, greener initiatives if you do, in fact, care so much about the climate, the environment, the people
Yeah.
that live in it, maybe?
Because big oil companies are such lobbyists and have too much control in our federal government.
You
Much as
can't
my
tell them that, though. That's not true. Don't say that, Justin. Shh. We don't
um,
talk about that here, apparently.
there's so much to unpack, and we could go on. There's two other questions that I feel are just really important to bring up. One is your recent sort of calling out, I guess, of the Edmonton Eskimos, and maybe can you talk about the racist connotations of the word Eskimo and why you feel it's important for the sports team to change its name?
Again, another interesting one. A lot of Inuit uh, weren't happy about me saying that they should not have such a racist, derogatory name. That's the other interesting part about what's happened in the last few decades for a group of people. Inuit, although we do share a culture, we share similar beliefs and ideations to an extent. That was all completely warped and changed during colonization and continues to be changing. Uh, amongst Inuit ourselves, even with my face tattoos, a lot of people think, a lot of Inuit believe I should not have them. And that's fine. I can be respectful of that. It's everybody is entitled to their opinion. But like so many other things, face tattoos were shamed out of us, were the devil's work, were a sin, were so you'll see and there's not very many women before that were born before the 1950s and 60s that have face tattoos because of that point in time the residential schools and the churches were saying no drum dancing, no throat singing, no face tattoos, you can't practice your who you are and your culture. So you know, again, as we've been saying, so much to unpack, but I think that in order for us to be able to have an understanding of Canadian history of around Indigenous peoples in circumstances for Indigenous peoples, we need to understand that there are so many different opinions and perspectives in that as well, and that as a group of people that have been through such intense changes over such a short period of time, that sometimes those perspectives are complete 180s. So there were lots of people that were very supportive, lots of Inuit that were very encouraging, but there were lots of Inuit that were not at all. And I think in there it's really important, and I really want to stress that I don't want to say that as an Inuk you should or should not be for the term, but I think as an Inuk that it should be for us to decide, and us alone. It should have no external sources influencing the conversation. And for me, my father has no issue with the word, and that's perfectly fine. And he's an older kind of, you guys are so sensitive and the younger generation kind of thing. And I'm like, no, we're just not putting up with the same BS that you guys were okay with. And I'm allowed to say that because he's my dad. But I wouldn't say that to other individuals. And I think that it's important that we understand as human beings, we all have our own opinions and perspectives. And my message was that it's up for Inuit and Inuit alone, because the Edmonton Eskimos, in no way, shape, or form, were providing any kind of positive compensation, whether it was time, money, or creating awareness. And still being able to make money though off that racist term, which was in the Indian Act from time to time. With all the revisions that the Indian Act has gone through, Eskimo has floated in and out of there. The Indian Act is legal racism. That is legalized. It's a document that legalizes racism.
Yeah, even the name
And
Indian Act, I mean, it's inherent within it.
yes, exactly. So it was, to me, the conversation needed to be by Inuit, period.
Yeah, I
That's
can
it.
understand that very much. You've been so gracious to spend so much time talking with me. My last question for you today. You also have now started a YouTube series where you're having conversations with Inuit, Métis, Indigenous peoples from around Canada. Can you just tell us a little bit about the YouTube series and where we can find you?
Yes, so I have a podcast slash video series, I guess, called Moments with Mumilaaq. I'm on everything, Spotify, iTunes, and then post on social media, of course, every Sunday. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. If you either search Mumilaaq or Mumilaaq Qaqqaq, I'm not at all hard to find. The purpose of these Moments with Mumilaaq segments is to create conversation and awareness of Indigenous peoples from all different walks of life, in all different kinds of position, of all different kinds of backgrounds, to promote and create, and in hopes of creating more conversation of real, especially around realization that as Indigenous peoples, we are all different, we're all diverse, we all do things from, I've had Cody Coyote, rapper, to Asiva Nakashuk, a singer from Nunavut, to Donna Kimalogjuk, the first Inuk cardiac surgeon. So I talk to all different kinds of people from everywhere, and it's super fun. And that's every Sunday at 7 p.m. And yeah, it's super
Yeah, I
fun.
watched the one with Cindy Blackstock and a couple other ones actually, and I was blown away.
Oh
I
my
thought it was
gosh.
so informative, and you do such a good job of turning the tables and becoming the interviewer while still offering some really interesting perspectives. So I would encourage anyone who watches this interview to check out Moments with Mumilaaq too. Mumilaaq, thank you so much for your time today. You are such an eloquent speaker. You are such a fierce advocate. I am so proud of the work that you're doing. Thank you for sharing your experiences, some of the needs of the North. We're trying to educate Southerners a little bit more. I wish you the most continued success in your Member of Parliament duties. And I am just so thankful and grateful to have been able to speak with you today.
Thank you, Justin. I really appreciate all your time and had so much fun talking. I'd love to do this again. And
Yes, please. Absolutely.
we'll keep in
Absolutely.
touch. Talk to you soon.
Thank you. Bye for now.
Matna. Thank you.